Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we're discussing our two most recent book club reads. Our first is Lolly Willowes by Silvia Townsend Warner, written in 1926 and recently brought back into prominence by readers and reviewers. Guardian journalist Robert McCrum included it in his 2015 list of the 100 best novels in English. High praise, but what did my book club make of it?
Our other book is an American classic, published to instant acclaim when its author, Carson McCullers, was only 23. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter is set in the small southern town of Columbus, Georgia, and tells the story of 5 isolated, lonely people who all yearn to belong to something outside of themselves, but ultimately are trapped by their own personalities and circumstances.
What did our book clubs think of these books? Should you try them with yours? Or add them to your personal reading pile? Keep listening to find out.
That's all coming up here on the Book Club Review.
It's a double bill episode, Lolly Willowes and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Both classics of a sort, although Lolly Willowes is certainly not as well known as The Heart is a Lonely Hunter.
I feel like The Heart is a Lonely Hunter just isn't so well known over here. We talked about this a bit in my book club, but in America, it's a stone cold classic, isn't it? I mean, it's taught in colleges, I imagine in schools. Lolly Willowes, I had heard of, but I had never read. My sense is that that's one that maybe had fallen out of print and has been rediscovered recently.
I think that might be right, but honestly, I'm a little vague on the details because listeners might recall that I missed a book club, tragically, devastatingly for me, and Lolly Willowes was the book that the group chose in my absence. I think they did very well. I'm very pleased with the selection, not least because it is a slim kind of sliver of a novel, and sometimes you really need that, I think, to fit in book club reading alongside, all the other books you want to read. Lolly Willowes, always so gentle and accommodating, suddenly announces that she is moving, alone, to the countryside. To her overbearing family in London, it is a disturbing and inexplicable act of defiance. But Lolly will not be swayed, and in the depths of the English countryside, she gradually discovers not only freedom and independence, but also, unexpectedly, her true vocation. The audiobook is published by Penguin and read by Olivia Darnley, and we have a clip.
"Say how do to Auntie Laura," said Caroline to Fancy. This was long ago in the refurbished nursery at Lady Place where Laura knelt timidly before her first niece, while the London nurse bustled round them, unpacking soft hairbrushes and pots of cold cream and hanging linen to air upon the tall nursery fender. "How do, Auntie Lolly?" said Fancy, graciously thrusting forward a fur monkey. "She's taken to you at once, Laura," said Caroline. "I was afraid this journey would upset her, but she's borne it better than any of us." "Journeys are nothing to them at that age, ma'am," said the nurse. "Now suppose you tell your new auntie what you call monkey." "Auntie Lolly, Auntie Lolly," repeated Fancy, rhythmically banging the monkey against the table leg. The name hit upon by Fancy was accepted by Marion and Titus. Before long, their parents made use of it also. Everard never spoke of his daughter but as Laura, even when he spoke of her to his grandchildren. He was too old to change his ways, and he had, in any case, a prejudice against nicknames and abbreviations. But when Laura went to London, she left Laura behind and entered into a state of Aunt Lolly.
She sort of goes along with it, doesn't she? It's part of this idea that somehow herself is erased and the loss of her name is part of that as she slips into this family life. It's her family, but it's not her own family. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's her brother's family. Because nowadays, a single woman of means, because she does have her own money, her own income that came through from her father after his death, and yet she ends up still living with her brother in London within this overbearing family, given the small spare room, not the large spare room, couldn't do that, giving her the small spare room where she quickly, to use the family's phrase, becomes indispensable. And the first half it's just life ticking along, right? It's just her in London after her father has died, but flashbacks to her own life growing up in this upper middle class family, and they're steeped in tradition and they're not very imaginative. And she certainly doesn't seem to bring any real critical thought or resentment to her situation. And yet, there is obviously this schism within the family where she puts her foot down at one point.
She steals an afternoon to herself, doesn't she? And she goes off to Kew Gardens. And although she has been reasonably content in a sort of passive way, living with her brother and his family in London, there have always been these hints that you sense that she loved living in the countryside and that she has this affinity with the natural world that's had to be tamped down and ignored while she's been in this London world. And she goes off to Kew, and as she comes back, she stops in at a greengrocer, and there's just something about the flowers and the vegetables. And then she gets this bee in her bonnet, doesn't she, about the place that it's all come from. She asks him, and he tells her about this little village called Mop End, is it? What's it called?
Little Mop?
Little Mop.
Great Mop? Great Mop?
It's so funny. The beginning of this book made me think of a Georgette Hare plot. Wealthy spinster has to go and live with brother's family, and in a Georgette Hare novel, you'd then have a handsome local aristocrat who she would meet riding in the park, and hijinks would ensue. And then it goes a bit Cold Comfort Farm in the middle. She goes off to this tiny little village in the sticks.
Well, we know that she's a bit of a dreamer. There's these little sly moments in the plot where she lets her facade of conventional middle-class spinster aunt drop, and it's often dropped at strategic moments, like when her brother and sister-in-law are trying to marry her off and get her off their hands. But certainly no one expects that she is going to leave the family fold. I loved this book. I was just rereading parts of it, and there's this really brilliant aside right in the beginning when she is accepting her fate and she's moving in with her brother and sister-in-law. She doesn't want to, but she accepts it. And the author gestures towards the niece who's a small child at that time, and Lolly's going to be looking after her. In 2 short paragraphs, she says, Fancy, who later went on to work throughout the war and be a modern woman, couldn't imagine why her aunt had ever just accepted this fate. But she doesn't appreciate what it was like at the time. And that was written in 1926, but it's also a very helpful reminder to a modern reader today where you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like it's sort of inexplicable why she accepted this fate for so long. And the author, who herself was very unconventional, is just, I think, saying to you, look, have empathy for where this woman was at that point in her life and what was expected.
And so,
the twist, Kate.
Exactly. You're reading away, but I certainly was thinking to myself, she's just a little bit too acquiescent to all of this. Is the worm going to turn? What's going to happen? And then suddenly, delightfully, there is this big plot twist. It's really hard to talk about it without spoiling it. Listeners, if you want to read this book and be surprised, then listen away now. Come back to us for The Heart is a Lonely Hunter a bit later on.
And that said, the twist that we're about to reveal, all of my book club knew about it beforehand because it is what makes this book a classic, I think, right? It would have otherwise just faded into obscurity. But what unfolds is truly bizarre and unexpected.
I like the way one reviewer summed it up very succinctly. Laura sells her soul to a surprisingly comforting and cheerful Satan and lives happily ever after as a witch. So you're like, well, I really did not see that coming, I have to say. Although there are some wonderful little moments leading up to it. So there's one scene where the brother and his wife, Caroline, her sister-in-law, they do go to some trouble initially when she comes to live with them to set her up with a husband. And she doesn't really make any effort with any of the men they invite over for tea, except there is one who is a slightly awkward fellow and he has a bit of a stutter. And with him, for some reason, she's quite forthcoming, quite relaxed, and feels able to speak her mind. And they get quite excited because they think, oh gosh, could this be the one? Maybe this is the man that she will consent to marry. But the author explains how she's really feeling. Though nothing would have induced her to marry him, she was very ready to talk to him, and even to talk naturally of what came uppermost in her thoughts. Laura's thoughts ranged over a wide field, even now. Sometimes she said rather amusing things and displayed unexpected general stores, of knowledge. But her remarks were, as a rule, so disconnected from the conversation that no one paid much attention to them. Mr. Arbuthnot certainly was not prepared for her response to his statement that February was a dangerous month. "It is," answered Laura, with almost violent agreement. If you are a werewolf, and very likely you may be, for lots of people are without knowing, February of all months is the month when you are most likely to go out on a dark, windy night and worry sheep. Henry and Caroline glanced at each other in horror. Mr. Arbuthnot said, "How very interesting. But I really don't think I am likely to do such a thing." Laura made no answer. She didn't think so either, but she was amusing herself with a surprisingly vivid and terrible picture of Mr. Arbuthnot, cloaked in a shaggy hide and going with heavy devouring swiftness upon all fours, with a lamb dangling from his mouth. So there are these little moments where you're like, ah!
But I read that at the time just as, you know, her personality.
Yeah,
She's a
me
bit
too.
of a dreamer. I didn't think that there was going to be, and to be clear, there aren't any werewolves later on in the plot. But this link to the occult, actually, I was reading about this. In the 1920s, and this book was written in 1926, there was a thing for the occult. So this selling your soul to the devil and this being a witch in the countryside, I mean, I'm not saying it was a trend by any means, but it was a little bit more in the public consciousness than it certainly is today. We should talk about that friendly devil. Because what I would say is that for the longest time, up until the very end, it's kept ambiguous. And I was very confident that there was no real devil and that it was all in Laura's brain, you know, that she was kind of making this up. And then, no, it gets more and more literal. And it is undeniable that she is having friendly conversations with the devil. And everyone else in the village is in cahoots with the devil too. And this doesn't induce them to do anything really terrible. In fact, it very comically just gives her the means to get rid of her loving, affectionate nephew who shows up on her doorstep.
It's a tremendously likeable book for lots of reasons. But I think when I was looking at the online reviews, Catherine with a C over in Goodreads gave it 2 stars and said, "It's like Barbara Pym started this story, left it unfinished, and then it was discovered by a manic Satanist who scribbled the rest of it all in one night. I totally enjoyed it, but what a hot mess." And I just wonder, you know, was that the right ending? Does it really work? It's a totally diverting and captivating read, but I'm not sure.
Well, you know what? We had an excellent book club discussion. And for the first 40 minutes or so, it was only me, Alice, and Charlie. And we didn't talk about anything else. We just dove right into this book. It made us laugh. It was very bemusing. It is quite slow. The writing itself is charming, and yet that first third or half, whatever the division is, nothing really happens, and you kind of are waiting for it to warm up. It's only when she finally leaves London to a part of the English countryside that I know quite well. It's the Chiltern Hills. And I say I know it well. I know it well only in that I stayed right in the heart of the Chilterns for a few nights and really wandered along the pathways. They're quite close to London, but they're tucked down, aren't they? There's this sense that you're hidden in these folds of land. I was there. I was really in the fields with Lolly, falling asleep on the side of the road.
I think the way the author writes about the English countryside was beautiful. The Penguin Modern Classics cover is this very autumnal illustration, and I just thought, oh yeah, that felt so right. It feels like quite an autumnal book.
Frances did join the book club towards the end. We do it over Zoom, so, you know, she could dip in and out. She was saying this is very of the 1920s when the spinster novel was a thing because there were so many unmarried women because there were so many men who had lost their lives in the First World War. And Frances was like, I love a spinster novel. Like, a spinster novel's great. And I was like, I have read a few and I never really knew it was a genre. But this one does feel like the pinnacle of that genre, just taken to the 10th degree.
Yes, I had come across that reading about it online. There's a blog called Furrowed Middlebrow, which also is a publisher's, but I'm not sure if they're connected. But he wrote, the novel became a surprise bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic when it was published in 1926. It was the inaugural selection of the Book of the Month Club. This might in part have been because there were so many unmarried women in the post-World War I years. And then there's a little quotation, women living and growing old, as common as blackberries and as unregarded, who could relate to the character's situation and savour her fantastic refusal of the role of demure, helpful, but largely invisible spinsterhood. A refusal without doubt that was, and still is, considerably harder to pull off in reality. It was tapping into something then. It's interesting that readers are still finding it relevant now, or that there's still something about it that we really enjoyed.
Yeah, I very much did enjoy it. But didn't you think there is something, she's not a mother, and yet it's almost worse because she is expected to be housekeeper, caretaker and to actually act as like the mother in a way that we might expect now, right? Like Carolyn, her sister-in-law, isn't really involved in rearing the children and sort of delegated to the spinster aunt, because why wouldn't it be? So I think today you think about thank God we don't use this term anymore, but if you were to think about an unmarried woman of independent means, quite frankly, I think there'd be a certain amount of envy from me. I'd be like, yes, what could you do? Where could you go? The freedom that would come with that. And in fact, it is freedom that she achieves in the end, with the help of the devil.
Her dream is not my dream. I mean, I have no desire to move somewhere like Little Mop.
No. I think I would. My story would probably end up somewhere a little bit more glamorous and busy.
For me, it's the writing, I think. It's beautifully written. It's very entertaining. And the pleasure really for me was there rather than in the story itself, which I think I agree with Catherine on Goodreads. I found just a bit over the top, really, which is a shame, but it's such a idiosyncratic book. That's part of its charm. I'd be curious to read something else by her.
Definitely a good one for book club. Slim, but tons to discuss and enjoyable, I think.
Paul Bryant gave it 3 stars, saying, I can see that in 1926 this was a strong, proto-feminist, whimsical, thoroughly English magical realist, subversively satanic cri de coeur, but for me, it was more of a shoulda, coulda, woulda. He concludes, Robert McCrum included Lolly Willowes in his list, the 100 best novels in English. Now, for sure, Lolly Willowes is a shoo-in for the 100 most charming oddities in English, but one of the all-time best? I think Satan must have been messing with Mr. McCrum's brain. Meanwhile, Catherine with a K gave it 5 stars, writing, Impossible to say much without giving away the treasures to be discovered in these pages. This is not a compelling page-turner read, but every time I decided to sit down with it, I was completely absorbed and bewitched. Beautifully and insightfully written. A shame it's so neglected now, and I encourage anyone interested in forgotten classics, feminist authors, or just a very well-written tale set in England to seek out this delightful and thought-provoking read. So yes, thank you very much to Laura's Book Club for flagging it up. Shall we move on to The Heart is a Lonely Hunter?
Which I should tell listeners I have read, but I read it probably about 12, 13 years ago. And the only memories I really retain of it is, 1, it was quite hard work, but a friend had loaned me the book and I felt compelled to read it. And 2, I remember it being in a small, forgotten Depression era town where nothing's really happening and I don't think anyone gets to leave. You're hopeful. Will they make it out of here? They're destined for greater things. And my memory, which is foggy, is that no, they do not.
Well, set in the small town in the middle of the Deep South, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter tells the story of John Singer, a lonely deaf mute, and a disparate group of people who are drawn towards his kind, sympathetic nature. The owner of the cafe where Singer eats every day, a young girl desperate to grow up, an angry drunkard, a frustrated black doctor, each pours their heart out to Singer, their silent confidant, and he, in turn, charges their disenchanted lives in ways they could never imagine. The audiobook is published by Harper Audio and narrated by Cherry Jones. Let's have a clip.
The 2 mutes had no other friends, and except when they worked, they were alone together. Each day was very much like any other day because they were alone so much that nothing ever disturbed them. Once a week they would go to the library for Singer to withdraw a mystery book, and on Friday night they attended a movie. Then on payday they always went to the 10-cent photograph shop above the Army and Navy stores so that Antonopoulos could have his picture taken. These were the only places where they made customary visits. There were many parts in the town that they'd never even seen. The town was in the middle of the Deep South. The summers were long, and the months of winter cold were very few. Nearly always the sky was a glassy, brilliant azure, and the sun burned down riotously bright. Then the light, chill rains of November would come, and perhaps later there would be frost and some short months of cold. The winters were changeable, but the summers always were burning hot. The town was a fairly large one. On the main street there were several blocks of 2- and 3-story shops and business offices. But the largest buildings in the town were the factories, which employed a large percentage of the population. These cotton mills were big and flourishing, and most of the workers in the town were poor. Often in the faces along the streets, there was the desperate look of hunger and of loneliness. But the two mutes were not lonely at all. At home they were content to eat and drink, and Singer would talk with his hands eagerly to his friend about all that was in his mind. So the years passed in this quiet way until Singer reached the age of 32 and had been in the town with Antonopoulos for 10 years.
I feel almost a bit nervous to talk about this one because it is such a classic and it feels like it needs to be studied and read carefully with spark notes, and people have probably written doctoral theses on it. We just came to it as readers. Maria in my book club brought it to us. She loves this book. She loves this author and her writing. It's one of the books that's most important to her. And so we acknowledged that we felt it was quite brave of her to do that, because I certainly have books that I really love, but I wouldn't want to read them with book club because I'd be really upset. People kind of savaged them. And so we were, I suppose, a bit honoured by her trust that she was willing to go through that experience, but she wanted us all to read it. It was an incredibly rich discussion and a read. I think all of us found it incredibly absorbing. The writing is extraordinary. Andy Kay in my book club pointed out, when you actually look at the sentences, they're so short. She barely uses commas because each sentence is so short. And that sounds like it might have this staccato effect, but it's not. It's the opposite. There's a kind of quietness and a still quality to this book, not only in the way it's executed, but also, of course, thematically, because at its heart, the character that everything pivots around is this character who is deaf and he's mute. And so there's just this silence. And then you've got these other characters. You've got Mick, who is a young girl who probably is the one your heart leaps towards, and you feel like McCullers herself. She was young. She was only 23 when she wrote this. And it feels like there may have been a lot of herself in that character. And she's just growing up in this small town where her family don't have any money and things are hard for them, but they're hard for everybody. And she has this interest in music that she discovers. And she overhears on a radio playing from someone's house. I think it's a Beethoven symphony. And she's never heard anything like it. And she's completely captivated. And then after that, she goes out in the evenings and she silently steals around the town, hoping to catch the moment when people put their radios on and that music drifts out through their windows. And then she carries that music in her head. So with her, it's this idea that that's the thing that she's yearning for, and she thinks that perhaps one day she might be a musician. And then there's Biff, who owns the local bar. I think the best way to describe the bar is it's like that Edward Hopper painting, you know, the one that you're thinking of when you say that Edward Hopper painting, you know, the lonely bar and the glass windows and the one woman isn't there sitting on the bar stools. Biff's bar is like that. It's a sort of forlorn.
I feel like that's probably quite. I always think that bar is quite fancy. I feel like Biff's bar might be a bit
down at heel. Well, it's true, if that, but there's something a bit forlorn about it. No one's having a great time in there, are they? They're all just sort of sitting. It's an all-night bar stroke diner, and very often it's the long night shifts that you're seeing things through Biff's eyes, and he's watching his customers. And so there's his perspective. And then there's Jake, who is this angry drunk. He sort of rolls into town. He hasn't got much money, but for some reason, Biff feels sorry for him or something towards him that means that he's happy to stand him drinks and basically look after him a bit. And he ends up staying with Singer. Singer offers him shelter one night, and then that becomes a place where he goes to stay. And then there's Dr. Copeland, and it's his experience of systemic racism and injustice, but he is someone who very fiercely wants to combat that and to strive for a better, fairer, more equal world. And he is just beaten down at every turn. And his great tragedy was that he had poured all his hopes into his children, his 3 children. And the trouble is that when they grow up, they become a part of the system as it exists. It's shown to be so powerful and so pervasive that they have no other option, really, other than to do what their sister Portia exemplifies, which is really to accept your fate and to accept your place in it and make the best of it that you can. And so she's a really wonderful character. She works for Mick's family. So slightly crazily, even though they don't have any money, they don't seem to have two pennies to rub together, but they still are middle class in that they have a servant who looks after them. And so she has almost a motherly relationship with Mick. And then finally, there's Singer himself, who is the still centre of the story. And his tragedy was that he had a friend, Antonopoulos, who was another deaf mute. And they used to communicate with one another through sign language, and they used to live together. They were friends. They were dear and close friends. And then something happens. And I would need to reread it to remember. I actually can't remember what triggers it, but Antonopoulos somehow goes into some kind of decline and he ends up being taken away and institutionalized. And so Singer is just bereft and is lonely. And he doesn't really have anyone else that he could communicate with in the same way that he communicated with Antonopoulos. And he doesn't have anyone else that he has that kind of relationship with. So that's his tragedy.
I was going to say, I preface that I read this a long time ago. So I was in my early 20s. And when you first began, I was thinking maybe I was too young for this kind of novel. Maybe I needed to be older. And then, of course, Carson McCullers was 23 when she wrote it. Like, what an old soul to be able to craft these characters in such different situations from her own, with such a different lived experience, different ages, at such a quality that it is a classic of American literature. I don't know anything about her, do you?
That is what's absolutely extraordinary about it. And when you read it, you just keep coming back to this with disbelief, because it's such a mature novel and there's just such a kind of wisdom and foresight in it that is the extraordinary thing. You know, there are passages when you read them that were important and relevant then, and they still feel important and relevant now. And I was thinking, you know, that is the mark, isn't it, of a true classic. It's a book that stands the test of time and a book that speaks to readers of any era. And this is one of those books, there's no question. She's drawing a portrait of these characters for sure, but she's also drawing a portrait of the town, and she's drawing a portrait of America, and at the same time capturing something about existence and loneliness and the difficulty we have in connecting. The Jake character is a communist and he is agitating for labour reform. He wants there to be a fairer society. He wants there to be a society where there aren't incredibly rich billionaires hoovering up all the profits and workers who are paid next to nothing. And I mean, does that sound like anything that we think about right now? You read that and it sends shivers down your spine because it was true then and it is so true now. And the other thing is, of course, the race relations theme. Again, incredibly prescient. There's a scene where the character of Jake meets Dr. Copeland. In a way, it's a point of connection that they have some commonality. You know, Jake is fighting for this communist ethos and to try and agitate and get men to strike and fight for their rights. And Dr. Copeland is trying to get black people to come together. And in that discussion, the conclusion is that Dr. Copeland can't fight the fight on his own. And he says, we need to get together and we need to march and we need to demonstrate to prove that we're worthy of more. And this was written in 1939, 28 years before Martin Luther King did gather together and march on Washington. And again, you read it and your jaw drops slightly. So it is extraordinary. It sounds depressing, but I didn't find it depressing, I think, because it's one of those books that's so good. It felt like a pleasure to encounter this writing and to experience this novel. And it's definitely one of those books that you feel like you want to read it, absorb it, feel yourself slightly changed by it. And amazing for book club, such a good discussion book.
I was wondering if it was so good as to be impossible to criticize or to have different points of view on the content.
I mean, I think it was definitely the case at the end. We give it scores and everybody gave it 5 stars or 4.5. And even with the 4.5s, we were like, well, why not 5? And that was the discussion. Like, what could you possibly, which was interesting. But it's so rich. It's one of those books where even when the discussion is all positive, it's like there's just so much to talk about and to consider. I think it's one of those books where when you finish it, you want to find out more about her. And I was grumbling, I feel like I just want to watch a really good film about her life or read something about her. Yeah, well, then you start to look into her a little bit, and her own life was an interesting one. It was rather like the life of one of her characters in that it was very tragic. She had suffered rheumatic fever at quite a young age, and that left her an invalid. And then she wrote this extraordinary novel when she was 23. It was an instant bestseller. It made her name. She was the literary sensation, Sally Rooney of her day. And she moved to New York with her husband and was the center of the literary and cultural world. And she became an alcoholic. She drank too much. She wrote other novels. And interestingly, when I was reading about her, the suggestion was that this was really the only one that was good and that the others weren't. But Maria said actually she's read all of her books and she thinks the others are equally good. In fact, some of them are even better. Certainly some of the short stories she thinks are just incredible. And then she died. She died very young. She died age 50.
So 2 good book club books. To recap, very different, I have to say. And interestingly, I bet you The Heart is a Lonely Hunter isn't on the best novels in English list.
Well, that's the thing. You see, I think here it's not on our mental list of the classics. But I suspect to an American, I'm sure it would be. And so it just feels like we really should be championing it here in the UK because it's a remarkable book. And Andy H. was saying, he was grumbling a bit about, you get these writers who are coming along now who are lauded praise to the skies. Perhaps he was thinking Sally Rooney again, I don't know. And he's like, what are they writing? It's so forgettable. You read these books and 2 years later, you've gone. This book, it will slip into your heart and it will stay there. It's a remarkable work. And these are the books that we should be reading. I thought it was interesting. I think there's definitely there's a place for both.
Kate, I want to talk about Robert McCrum's list because I found it online.
Yeah.
It's from 2015.
I think I've looked at it before. I think I wanted to get excited about it when it was first published, but it's not hugely thrilling.
My first take would be to agree with you. I'm like, Lord of the Rings, Catch-22, David Copperfield, The Great Gatsby, Ulysses, Call of the Wild, Catcher in the Rye, Heart of Darkness,
I don't think he was trying
Lolita.
to surprise anybody.
Also, I thought this immediately. I was like, well, this is just the pictures that they put at the top, but those are all male writers. And then I'm just looking, The Guardian is so good at how they curate their content. Right at the top, underneath the header and subheader, they then have links to follow-on articles. One of those is Robert McCrum reflects on his choices. But the next one is 1 in 5 doesn't represent over 300 years of women in literature, a response. And actually, I haven't clicked on it, but my assumption, interesting. Kate, the subhead on this article is, where is Carson McCullers? Patricia Highsmith, Erica Jong, and Margaret Atwood. Rachel Cook responds to Robert McCrum's lists of great works of literature. Yeah.
I'm gonna read that now.
Well done, Rachel Cook.
You have to send me the link. Maybe we'll post links to both in the show notes. You can make up your own words.
I mean, honestly, 100 best novels in English, especially if they're all from England. I mean, I wonder what the split is across different nations. All very interesting. But hey, you and I are always very critical of awards and lists, but they're fun too. So I won't hate on Robert McCrum too much.
He's done a lot of reading.
Oh, this is amazing. There's a little snippet here where she says, it also seems odd to include Silvia Townsend Warner's witchy feminist tale, Lolly Willowes. A good book, but not a great one. And yet to exclude, say, Margaret Kennedy's The Constant Nymph, the bestseller of 1924, and an exquisite study of jealousy? I've never even heard of that. That sounds interesting. Well, 2 classics, 2 female writers, and 2 really good book club discussions. So listeners, have at it. Inspired by Lolly Willowes and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, here are some more recommendations for your next book club book.
I'm going to recommend something I think I might have recommended before, but I'm very happy to bring it back. It's called Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee. And it was just a little bit in my mind as I read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Obviously, To Kill a Mockingbird is a very different book, but to me, I felt like there was a real commonality between them. They're both set in these small southern towns, and they are both dealing with the sort of strange way of living that they had back then under segregation. And also this cultural context of the Great Depression, I think the existential despair that lots of Americans were feeling at the time, and this sense of hopelessness. And so Harper Lee wrote a novel that ultimately was quite hopeful. But then, of course, the famous thing about her was that she never managed to write another book. And so it is this really fascinating mystery about, well, why didn't she? Casey Sepp chose to investigate notes that Lee was writing on a trial that she got interested in following. It was the trial of a man called the Reverend Willie Maxwell. He was a rural preacher accused of murdering 5 of his family members for insurance money in the 1970s. With the help of a savvy lawyer, he escaped justice for years until a relative shot him dead at the funeral of his last victim. Despite hundreds of witnesses, Maxwell's murderer was acquitted, thanks to the same attorney who had previously defended the Reverend. So it's all very corrupt. But as Alabama was consumed by this story of the serial killer, Harper Lee got consumed by her interest in the trial, and she wrote thousands of pages of notes and documents, but she never actually managed to turn it into a book. And so Sepp's book is about that story. It's about that true crime story. It's about Harper Lee's interest in it, and it's about Lee's life overall, and I suppose the demons that haunted her, and why she never managed to write another book. And what I loved about this is that by the time you finished it, you understand why she never wrote another book. It made perfect sense to me, and you're content with that because you have this real insight that maybe Lee herself didn't have, but, I think the brilliance of this book and the research that Sepp does is that it does, to my mind, solve this enduring mystery about this incredibly important and interesting writer. So really recommended. I haven't managed to persuade my book club to do it, but I do think it would be a great one for book club.
I had Harper Lee in the back of my mind when you were talking about Carson McCullers. So that makes perfect sense as a follow-on recommendation.
I'm not sure she maybe found it a bit annoying to be compared to Harper Lee all the time, which I think she was. I think she found that quite irritating.
It's not just that they're female writers' debut novels. There's more to it than that.
How about you?
Now, when I was reading Lolly Willowes, and especially when Frances started to talk about the spinster novel, front of my mind were 2 famous English authors, Barbara Pym, who, surprisingly, I haven't read that much of, but is beloved by the English, I would say, and wrote very much about upper middle class intellectual families. I read one in Oxford, often a bit dry, maybe in this same tone. Now, as I say, I'm less familiar with Pym, whereas Anita Brookner, I've talked about on the pod before. I am not going to recommend Hotel du Lac, which is a wonderful novel. It won the Booker Prize in the early 1990s, I think it was. Speaking of debuts, the book I wanted to recommend is A Start in Life, and it was Anita Brookner's debut, published in 1981. And it has a lot of similarities with Lolly Willowes in that it follows this young woman's life, Ruth Weiss, from childhood into middle age, and the drain of relationships on her own sense of empowerment, and also her disappointment in what is possible in terms of romance. Actually, she's quite different from Lolly in that sense. She was brought up to think that Cinderella will go to the ball, and then the ball never materializes, and her parents are these demanding, helpless, selfish individuals. And like Lolly, she's sort of thrust into this position as carer and guardian, even when she's still a child herself. It was written in 1981, and so it's set more in the 1970s, before my time, but I do know that this was a period in British life and culture where things were tough, and it felt like the end of the empire and a constant decline. Is that fair? I mean, I know you were but a wee poppet at that stage, Kate, but it was after the swinging 60s, and it just fell flat. And this novel is not uplifting. It is not cheerful. You know what? It's not even charming. But I do think it would be an excellent book club book because there's so much going on, and as a window into a time and place when expectations around what women would do were changing. Ruth Weiss becomes an academic, and she's working on the 2nd volume of her Women in Balzac's novels. And of course her peers don't take her seriously, all of whom are male. But she is still carving out this path for herself. And yet at the same time, that weight of history, that expectation of what women will do and what they should do is dragging her down. I'm recommending a book for book club, as I often do, that I didn't love myself, but which I would love to discuss.
I was going to say, I'm sure I remember you finding this one a bit exasperating.
Did I talk? Maybe I did talk about it on the pod.
But divisive is
well,
often
come on,
quite
because
good
it's
for
like, as I say, she's not solving problems, Kate. She's just kind of being leeched. The life is being leeched out of her by her parents. Any attempts she makes to step away, she's pulled back. Unlike Lolly Willowes, who just kind of cuts herself loose and floats away.
Can I call you Lolly from now on?
Absolutely not.
You know, listeners, Laura actually does have a nickname in our house. You know what your nickname is, don't you?
Of course. I don't know that they're going to call me that much longer.
She's known as Laura Bloop for some reason, which is the nickname that my middle child, when she was much younger, gave Laura, and she's been known as Laura Bloop in our house ever since.
I like that name. I should say, Kate regularly talks about me as Laura Bloop to her husband, to her now much older children. They don't know my real last name.
No one knows your real name. That's all for this episode. Our book recommendations were Furious Hours by Casey Sepp and A Start in Life by Anita Brookner. And we'll link those 2 Guardian articles we mentioned in the show notes. If you're looking for reading recommendations, don't miss our Best of 2021 shows. Episode 109, Parts 1, our Best Book Club books, and 2, Best Things We Read over the course of the year. It's jam-packed with over 70 favourite reads, so don't miss it. And for listening inspiration and book recommendations anytime, do check out our website, where you'll find our archive of over 100 episodes to browse through, from book club discussions to our regular roundup of things we're reading for ourselves. You can also explore our library of articles, including our most recent, on our favourite literary podcasts. Have a look to find out the bookish shows we listen to when we're not busy making ours. If you'd like to keep up the conversation with us between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at bookclubrvwpod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate and review the show and help other listeners find us. If you really like what we do, please share the episode link on social media and help us spread the word. But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.